In this lecture, the professor gives tones of information about cultural diffusion. And the professor says that there are three types of cultural diffusion: direct, forced, and indirect. Direct diffusion happens when two cultures are physically next to each other and naturally share cultural ideas. For example, the USA and Canada hold similar cultural values. Forced diffusion, on the other hand, is different. It occurs when one culture conquers another and forces its own beliefs and customs on the less dominant culture. For example, when Spain and Portugal conquered the areas of Central and South America, priests from Europe forced the natives to become Catholics. The last one is the indirect cultural diffusion. This type of cultural diffusion happens through technology like the internet. For example, someone from South Africa might watch a YouTube video about Korea food and therefore adopt it as a part of their everyday diet. In this lecture, the professor gives social studies information about role distancing. Role distancing is when a person presents themselves to a distant from the role that they play. There are two cases of role distancing. The first case is when a person does not get involved in common roles and the ones are involved in. An easy example is when a person opens their eyes during a religious prayer that requires closed eyes. It means that they disagree with that role of practice and are distancing themselves from it by opening their eyes. A second case of role distancing is when a person denies their role completely. The example the professor gives is when a person says that they are employed when they are actually unemployed. In some cases, it is defensive role a person takes due to their inability to accept the role. The lecture is about carbon capture techniques that we use today. We are generally taken from two types of methods: post-combustion and pre-combustion. With post-combustion, CO2 is removed from the fossil fuel is burned. This method is popular because it separates CO2 from natural gas. On the other hand, with pre-combustion, carbon is captured by trapping the CO2 before the fossil fuel is burned. Pre-consumption actually provides a high concentration of CO2 than post-combustion. The professor also talks about two major differences between the two methods, which are the cost and the effects on the environment. Pre-combustion is not only cheaper but post-combustion, but it also able to prevent most of power plants' emission from entering the atmosphere. This makes it even better to use for the environment. During this lecture, the professor explains the concept of memory gap, which is the loss of information in a person's memory for a specific event. He offers two reasons for why this particular phenomenon occurs. The first reason is that the person experiences some heightened emotions. During a car accident, a person experiences a big emotional change and cause them to remember things inaccurately and not remember something at all. In the second reason, he explains that memories can be altered when the wording of the situation is altered. Again, in a car accident, the choice of words a police officer uses can alter the perspective a person has on the situation by insinuating particular motives or actions. These insinuations can become a part of the person's memories of that event and produce false or inaccurate memories. So through these two examples of emotional stress and language alteration, people can acquire memory gap. In the lecture, the professor describes how railroads played a large role in expanding American businesses in the 17th century. He gives two main ways in which the railroad improved business. First, railroads opened new pathways for business, whereas a business could previously only sell to local because of the limits and time it took to transport goods. Now they could sell an item all across the country because they could ship salesmen and goods anywhere they pleased. Secondly, the use of transportation gave businesses more options. Rather than needing to centralize all industries around the raw materials for creating something, a business could ship coal, wood, or other resources to their manufacturing plant, then make their products, then ship it somewhere else entirely. So the railroad revolutionized the way business was limited by space and resources by providing alternative options for markets and transportation. The lecture described innovatory developments as happening in two different ways, intentionally and accidentally. The professor used an example for each different way of inventing. The first was about inventing the light bulb. The light bulb was invented to solve the annoyance of using a candle for light and therefore was intentionally invented and became popular immediately. However, the second example was about discovering the X-ray. Scientists discovered the X-ray but had no idea how to put it to good use, and therefore the X-ray was an accidental invention. Both examples demonstrated the difference between intentional and accidental inventions. In this lecture, the professor explains the negative damaging effects of mining for shale oil. He explains his reasoning through two examples of the lasting damage this process has. In the first example, he outlines how the process by which shale oil is combusted is bad for the environment. When it combusted, it releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This carbon dioxide is produced at a quicker rate than the trees, water, and ground can reabsorb it, meaning it just builds up in the atmosphere. This is one factor that is leading to what we know as a global warming. The second example has to do with the process by which 3 liters of fresh water are used to produce 1 liter of shale oil. While being a large amount of fresh water, this water is also contaminated and undrinkable, or left underground where it seeps into other water sources and contaminates those. So, the professor uses these examples to highlight the negative effects of shale oil mining.